everybody, and welcome to ABL Down on the Farm, episode 18, where we talk about all things prospecting, but especially prospecting in the ABL, a 30-team dynasty league with a glorious 20 spots for minor leaguers for a total of 600 prospects. So tonight, I am very thrilled to be joined by Tom, my friend and compatriot in many fantasy leagues, but more recently in the ABL. So we're going to talk to him a little bit about his ABL experience along with some other baseball stuff. And then we're going to do a deep dive into some very geeky, which I'm very excited about because I'm a baseball geek, fantasy baseball, scouting versus data, and the potential marriage of the two in evaluating prospects. So without further ado, I will bring in Tom. Tom, welcome back to the show. Thanks for joining.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So the last time I had you on, you were not yet an ABL owner. And now you have been indoctrinated into the ABL, and we're very excited to have you. You took over the White Sox team, and we'll talk a little bit about that during the show and your indoctrination by fire into the ABL. So I'm very interested to hear your impressions of that. I know we have like a lot to dive into in terms of prospecting later in the show, but wanted to do a couple other little housekeeping notes, if it's all right with you. The first of which is that our buddy Jeff, owner of the St. Louis Cardinals, and he's also in the League of Roto Junkies with us, has now joined our kind of like keeper home league catbird, right? Which you and I have been together since 2013. You've been in that league a little bit longer. So Jeff's in that league. He took over for an abandoned team, and he's actually in second place right now.
I was going to say he's doing quite well so far. So far, so good.
He's acquitting himself.
I like the team he built, though. I mean, I think more than just obviously a week's worth of standings. I think he's actually he's a sharp guy. So I think he's figured out some of the tricks to kind of competing in that league. Even right off the bat. So.
Yeah, no, it's great. I don't think either one of us is surprised. We're thrilled to have Jeff in the league. He has a ton of value, and it'll be interesting to see how he does throughout the course of the season because it is different than Dynasty, right? It's different. There's not really any prospecting in it, except for like the guys who are like on the cusp of getting to the majors. So it's a very different experience. But we're thrilled to have Jeff in that league. That's a league I'm shackled with being the commissioner, and you used to be the commissioner.
I was one-time commissioner, indeed. Yeah. The thankless job of commissioning. Yes,
very true.
As annoying as I am, I always try to respect that role because
you're fine. If I could have like 11 other owners, like good, hey, we'd be good. So before we delve into your introduction into ABL, I just wanted to touch very briefly on a prospect I was very excited about when he came up to the majors. But this goes back a long time ago.
Most of our audience may not have been born yet.
Yeah. So sadly, I'm a little bit older than most of our audience, right? But I remember watching Dwight Gooden when he was 19 years old and came up to the major leagues. And the reason I'm talking about Dwight Gooden tonight is I recently sat next to Dwight Gooden at a comedy event for charity at Madison Square Garden. And so just a couple of things about this experience. So my wife and I, Maria, who you know Maria, we're walking into the garden, and we have these seats that are pretty close to the front. They were comped to us by one of our outside law firms. So we go to the front, and we had seats 3 and 4. And sitting in seats 1 and 2 was a couple. And I asked them, like, oh, I think we have seats 3 and 4. Do you mind if we get by you? And they stood up. And when the dude stood up, I was like, that's Dwight Gooden. And the New Yorker in me was trying to be very calm. I was like, be cool, right? And the baseball geek was me like, oh my God, it's Dwight Gooden, right? And Dwight's still alive for those concerned, right? Because he's obviously had
not a sure thing,
right? But I did want to briefly touch upon the lighter side of Dwight Gooden, better side, and to remind everybody of Dwight Gooden and his incredible curveball, right? And the thing I like about this highlight reel, okay, is it's against the Chicago Cubs. right, from the mid '80s. But look at that thing, right? And look at that windup, right? It's a thing of beauty, right? And this was a 19-year-old kid who came up to the major leagues, completely dominated the net, completely
Mhm.
for 2 years, right? He had a great rookie season, and in his second season had one of the all-time great single seasons in Major League history. His 1985
Mhm.
year, where he had a 153 ERA and 267 strikeouts, if I remember correctly. His first year, he had more strikeouts. He had 276. But really gaudy numbers for a 19-year-old and 20-year-old. And so, like, I know you're younger than I am. But what are your like recollections about Dwight Gooden, or how did you first become aware of Dwight Gooden as a player?
So Dwight Gooden came into my consciousness. My baseball consciousness starts a little bit later than that, right? So the first time I sort of worked my way backwards into the understanding of who Dwight Gooden was. So my first memory, I believe it was the Yankees. I think in 97, 98, somewhere in there, where he had I'd been aware that he'd been bouncing around the league and suspended, but the first time I saw him pitch, I think, was with the Yankees against the Red Sox, and
Yep.
he'd signed. And this was the very tail end. I think it might have been. Maybe he ended up in Cleveland a year after that, something like that. There's
He
two.
had a year in Tampa Bay. He had a year in Tampa Bay.
Maybe it's Tampa that I'm thinking of. I don't know, but it was near the end. I mean, it wasn't the Dwight Gooden. And of course, the people I happened to be watching the game with kind of enlightened me a little bit as to there was some history there that was more relevant. And to kind of look up who this person was. Now, Baseball Reference didn't exist back then, or if it did, I was certainly not aware of it. So the way that you found out about a player was kind of going to some of these kind of to books, basically, to read about a player. That's the extent of which you can understand. And as time has gone on, obviously, and you're able to kind of put these things into context from a statistical perspective, and more of that data becomes available, you start to realize what that really meant. And then obviously you kind of put the video and you mentioned 85, 86. Obviously the Red Sox was a very important kind of crossing of the paths
Yeah.
with my team's history. So, from that perspective, he came into my consciousness. And then, of course, as I think 97, 98 came into play, then that's where Pedro Martinez obviously arrived on the scene, who, I think many people who were around for Dwight Gooden say Dwight Gooden. For many people who were around during Pedro Martinez, say Pedro Martinez. There's a similarity there in terms of the utter dominance and there's kind of a clear differentiation between like the ace, if you will, of the league. I think the closest we've come to that was maybe some of the Kershaw windows most recently that I can really point to, where there was one singular pitcher that was
Right.
so far head and shoulders above the rest. And obviously then Pedro, as Pedro's career evolved, it was kind of short-lived if you really think about it. By '04, he wasn't really the same guy. So there's also a similarity there. I mean, I guess he
Yep.
had a longer tenure at the Expos, but his Red Sox prime was actually shorter lived than I think it at least it seemed like, because it was such an important moment in at least
Yeah.
in my
No, for
baseball
sure.
history.
Pedro's in
And
the.
I think Gooden has some of those similarities there and that overlap
Yeah, that's interesting. Interesting comp. I hadn't thought of that before.
for different reasons. I think one was a smaller guy, and the other one maybe had
Yeah,
other
right,
other
100%.
extracurricular habits.
Well, Dwight had other problems. Um,
The ABL handbook may have had a risk
yeah, a
grade
little
on him for
asterisk on
other
that. Yeah,
reasons.
like he would have gotten off the field ding. Um, Dwight, when Dwight came up, I mean, there were a couple of things about him. I mean, the guy I comp him to in current times is Spencer Strider,
Sure,
because Strider came up with two pitches, and when
sure.
Dwight Gooden came up, he was a two-pitch pitcher, fastball, curveball, and
Sure.
they were both incredibly electric. I have
Mhm.
no idea what the scouting grades were on them, but I can tell you they were both outrageous.
Sure.
Um, and Gary Carter, the Mets catcher at the time, famously said that in 1985 he basically only threw those two pitches the whole year. He had no third pitch,
Yeah. Yeah.
and he completely dominated the National League. Like,
Mhm.
it was lights out. And back then they would go like 8, 9 innings. It wasn't like throwing max effort all the time for 6 innings, 7 innings, and
Yeah.
then like turning it over to the bullpen, right? I mean, these,
6 innings, 7 innings. You're dating yourself even with the 6, 7 inning thing. I mean,
right,
how
right.
many
Now
more
we're
of
at
those
five,
starts are
right?
we seeing anymore? You
Yeah,
know?
I've seen a lot of baseball,
Yeah,
so you know, so I mean,
yeah,
Dwight was just this incredibly exciting pitcher. He had a beautiful windup, and Sandy Koufax. I'll never forget this. Like he was being interviewed on a game between the Dodgers and the Mets, and this is right around 1985. It was the game of the week, and Vince Scully was doing the play-by-play, and they had Koufax in the booth, and this is before Gooden had off-field issues. And Koufax said that he would trade his past for Dwight Gooden's future. And to me, that was the
it's
ultimate
high
compliment.
praise. Yeah,
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 that's how good he
yeah,
was.
yeah,
So like to be able to like meet Dwight Gooden and sit next to him like for a
yeah,
comedy show, and also to get a sense of his sense of humor, which was pretty funny,
yeah.
was a big thrill. So that was a lot of fun. But always good like catching up with hit
Yeah.
heroes. So that was good.
No, but I go back again. For me, it's it's funny you mentioned the name Koufax, right? I mean, that's the other, if you go the previous generation, similar kind of concept there, where a lot of people, again, I wasn't around for that, but it's that difference making player he's so far above and beyond all the others that everyone knows that one player from that era,
Sure.
in those terms.
Yeah, 100%. Now, us Cardinal fans would say Bob Gibson too.
Bob Gibson had a good, yeah,
Yeah,
fair
but
enough,
yeah,
fair
but
enough.
yeah, but yeah, those two guys in the
Yeah,
National League basically
no,
dominated the
for sure.
sport for a better part of the '60s.
No.
Um, all right, so let's talk a little bit before we totally geek out on prospecting. Let's talk about your trial by ABL. All right, so you've come into the league, and you've got a deep reservoir of fantasy experience, including dynasty experience. But I'm curious to hear your impressions of the ABL. With a tilt towards your impressions of the prospecting scene, but just I'm interested generally in your reactions to the league and lessons you've learned or kind of where your head's at.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think one thing that's, I guess when I joined, and I remember, when we spoke the last time, one of the things I mentioned was my general lean towards hitting prospects, right? And I know I'm diving right into it with this point, but something that really has stood out to me is the valuation on pitching, especially because of the construction of the league settings, because of the owner preferences, which effectively sets the market, right? If you think about pitchers and hitters being completely separate pools of assets, right? You cannot take I mean, there's obviously Otani, but without you can't really take a pitcher and put him into the hitter pool, and you can't put a hitter into the pitcher pool.
Right.
So because those two pools are effectively two separate classes of assets, you can choose by a market to basically weight one of those two pools 50-50, 60-40, 70-30, 80-20. And so different leagues will kind of inherently develop kind of weights that are very different for those two things. And I found that the premium on pitching has basically, led me to effectively, lean much more heavily into the pitching prospect than I would have in just about any other. I mean, you're familiar with my dynasty strategy in general. In any other dynasty league, even in a keeper league, right? I think in just about every scenario, my approach has generally been not to value the pitching prospects, particularly because of the risk and the discounts that come with, basically missing a year or two, either of development or actual production. But because the way that the market weights appear to be set, at least in my whatever it's been 6 months in the league, I've found myself acquiring pitching more than I thought I would.
Uh-huh.
I've made several hitters for pitcher trades. If you think about, effectively, if you take the biggest names from my roster that have left, you would take Evan Carter, Colton Cowser, two prime hitting prospects. I suppose you put Tick Hence in that category as well. So one pitcher, but two
Sure.
kind of headline hitters. And the guys that have come in are Brandon Pfaadt, Max Meyer, DL Hall. Like these are all kind of pitching, pitching prospects, notably that are much more proximate to the majors, right? I'm still not necessarily spending heavy capital investing in, far away pitching, but I did put a few dollars in the auction. I did put a few draft picks towards 17, 18-year-old pitchers, which as you well know, in my general strategy, is not really
Very
something I
non-Tom,
would do.
very
Yeah,
on
yeah,
Tom.
yeah,
It is very on Tom. Yeah,
very
that's
much so.
interesting. Yeah, so like one of the things that's interesting to me about ABL is that um, there are a lot of owners who gripe about the risk of pitchers and gripe about the uncertainty of their development, right? But just about everybody pays through the nose for pitching,
Right,
right? And there is truly a real premium on pitching, and so
right.
you'll see trades for pitchers, pitching prospects,
That's
and
basically the acquisition cost paid for by other teams for pitching has led me to the strategy that I'm
right.
adopting.
And
Right
so,
to
but
your
you
point.
you you see it happening, and I really don't care about people's gripes, whatever, because clearly the market bears it, right? I mean, and then when you get up to the auction, you see pitchers who are very mediocre going for $30 for
Right,
high 20s, right? And
right,
it really emphasizes the value of having young guys who you can rely on for whatever they are, right? And when you talk about for however risky they are, that's what I'm talking about. So I have Yuri Paris, who's obviously on the shelf right now, but at a $3 is what I have him at right now because of inflation from his rookie year. um, would you rather have that than you know an expensive guy you spent $31 on or $24 like Lucas Giolito who's out for the year, right? And it kind of underscores like the value of these pitching prospects.
hmm No, absolutely. So I think big picture, I think that's definitely, an important consideration that I think has kind of adjusted my view on kind of how I would value assets in a league like this. I think, taking a step back, you asked, what I've learned, et cetera. I think one thing that I've found is I've been very, you know, um, positively impressed effectively by the average owner in this league, right? I think if you take the 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 average discussion that you're having on a day-to-day basis, it's pretty clear that the baseball knowledge through and through is pretty good. And yeah, I know in leagues we've shared before, we've griped about some of the bottom feeder teams where you feel like, it's hard to have a conversation because you feel like we're not having the same conversation about baseball. I think
Right.
most of the owners, I think for the most part, and we've talked about, in some cases, maybe on the prospect side, there's a lack of interest there. So maybe that's, but when it comes to the overall, what makes a valuable asset in this league, you generally find that most owners are, sharper than your average league, right? I think I dare say this is probably the strongest group of owners that I've been a part of.
Yeah, no, it's very good, and that it's high praise because we're certainly in a lot of leagues.
Yeah.
I tend to agree with that. It's also when you have a 30-team league, that is actually a more impressive statement when you think about it because there are just so
Right.
many
It's
owners,
harder
right?
to fill. Yeah, yeah. And that's a credit to Duke, I think, and I guess the executive committee. And I'm still not totally clear who's in charge beyond Duke, but whoever else is involved, it's a credit to those people in terms of everybody that's contributing to making this league what it is. I mean, I
Right.
think
I'll ask Duke, who's really interested. I have a feel like I know the answer, but Duke's going to be on the show later in the month. So I have a commissioner series where I have Duke coming on at the end of the month, and actually James from Major League Dynasty is going to be on.
okay. Oh, good for him.
So,
He's,
yeah.
a,
So
he's another fellow attempting retiree like me. I feel like at some point he was looking to abdicate. So
advocate the commissionership. So
the
I'll
commissionership,
ask him
yeah,
about
he's
that. Yeah. I would.
burning out like I did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Rather than retiree, I think it just makes you smart. um, if you see the message board in Catbird, you're like,
Yeah.
maybe I shouldn't be a commissioner anymore. Um, yeah, so that I agree. The ABL is like a really strong league. A lot of good owners. Definitely some diversity in terms of the interest in prospects, right? And you kind of feel that out as you go along.
Yeah.
But it sounds like you're enjoying the kind of first season at the ABL, and I know you have some challenges on your roster. You're already like
Sure.
super loaded. You were the number one ranked minor league system in the prospect handbook.
Mhm.
Um, and you're probably richly deserved. You inherited some of that, but
I
you've also
inherited a very, very strong team, so hard for me to take too much credit for that. I mean, I had a very strong team with the number one overall pick. I mean, it's you're gonna have a lot of good minor leaguers to begin with. I'd like to think that the acquisitions I've made have helped, but it was going to be hard to not be highly ranked from a farm perspective in the first couple of years here with the
right. Well, I mean, your first round draft pick turned out pretty good. He's in the major leagues already. So
He
why,
did.
why?
He did.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean the Langford pick. I mean, I felt I joked about picking Skeens and other things, but to me, if we're going to quickly delve into the FYPD piece, I don't want to take too much credit for picking Langford first overall, right? I think. I mean, I don't. I cannot think of another league where he did not go
yeah.
first.
I mean, he's the consensus one this year. I think
I can, yeah, and honestly, I'm probably one of the people who was saying that, making the argument that the Langford Cruz gap was probably overstated, and that Cruz probably still has not had his chance to, you know, put his production up against Langford and really kind of in a meaningful sample.
right,
So I think there's still it's still not decided, right? I think just because Langford got brought up because his team is competitive and trying to win right away, and that probably has more to do with it than the
right.
difference in Langford versus Cruz's skill set.
Yeah, I
We'll
don't think
talk
Dylan
about
Cruz is any rush to the majors, given the national situation.
yeah. I mean, I have my there was some message board, one of the channels in ABL where we were having this discussion about whether there's a ton of value of seasoning prospects in the minors beyond the economic benefit that the team gets of added control in their competitive window, and I
Right,
think teams show their hands fully on that front, in that the competitive teams seem to magically have all their prospects start up with the club, and all the
yeah,
non-competitive teams magically seem to find their players to need more seasoning
right.
on.
They need more seasoning. Yeah,
Yeah, more
exactly right.
seasoning, more defense, maturity, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah,
And I'm not someone who is completely against the idea of minor league development, but I definitely think that a lot of that is overstated. I think it's a methodology that applied at a time where guys weren't turning 14 and from then on have effectively professional coaching for 7-8 years by the time they get to be major league available in some form via the draft or whatever.
right. And it's certainly different for college players too.
Right,
They're really
especially college bats.
right, or more advanced. I mean,
Yeah,
you could see on the pitching side, for example, guys like, Andrew Painter, he's obviously has some
right,
injury issues, or,
right,
Ricky Tiedemann, who's like,
right.
close, but like, and going back to Dwight Gooden for a second, I mean, that's kind of what makes him remarkable is he was up at 19
Yeah,
pitcher,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
So, pretty unusual to see that. I mean, last
yeah.
year we saw Yuri Perez at 20, like
Right.
debut, right?
Yeah, I mean, you could go back to Kershaw and ERA, I think 4.5 in his rookie
Right,
year. I mean,
right, right.
some of the best pitchers ever. 19-year-old pitchers are not good.
Yeah, Koufax had some rough years too at the beginning.
Yeah, yeah,
So,
yeah.
so sure enough, so let's pivot because I do want to talk about our main topic for this evening, which I've lovingly called marrying data and scouting. Get a room or a prenup. So, you know, so first of all, like, thank you so much. I've thanked you before. You were present, but in writing. Thank you so much for helping me with the prospect handbook this year
Sure.
because and I know not everybody who might be listening to the show has like looked at it, but like you know, it is an enormous undertaking to rank up to 600 prospects based on scouting grades. There's a lot of data input, and the work that you did helping build the benchmark and the modeling and the equations in order to like just kind of apply my weights for whatever they're
Yeah.
worth to the scouting grades was
Well, I
enormous.
had to be able to rig the machine so that my team would come out first, and they would
Yeah, yeah,
rank.
right, exactly. Yeah, I don't think that actually required much rigging, but like it did it with Jackson Churio being ranked one.
I was going to say, yeah,
Jackson
I
Holiday ranked
pushed
two.
somebody,
Jackson
yeah,
Holiday was
non-Jackson Holiday first. So yeah,
yeah. So not entirely rigged in your favor. Not that any of that's actually worth much, but but it's an evolving process. And what I'm interested in talking with you tonight about is concepts of marrying the scouting reports to on the field results, right? And the idea is the more advanced minor league players get, and the more data we have on them in terms of their actual performance, should we and can we um, rationally and responsibly start giving the on the field results more weight than scouting grades? And what's the appropriate balance? And then related to that, what are assuming we can do that, what are the appropriate metrics or statistical outputs that we should be looking at for both hitters and pitchers in making that evaluation, and then we can talk about how the heck to scale it, right? But so let's talk with the first question. I mean, do you think it is possible and rational to marry the data, the on the field results, with the scouting and a prospect evaluation methodology?
I think it absolutely is, right. So as the numbers guy, I have 1,000 spreadsheets, and I love to look at all the stats and put them in a bunch of different shapes and positions and see what I can see from it, etc. Um, I'm still a firm believer that the scouting analysis that we're doing still has value, and that so let's take a first step back as to thinking about, you mentioned kind of which metrics to look at. Forgetting a specific metric, the first thing you have to think about is a lot of the analysis that we do when we look at stats are somewhat still, overly kind of, we're reading too much into noise, right? If you think about the analysis that's been done about what I'll call stabilization points, which is basically the amount of data, the number of observations that you need before a metric can be considered stable, is often much larger than any sample that you hear people quote all the time about some indicative value for a player. So what do I mean by that? So, taking the example of like something like strikeout rate, right? Just something very basic, like the percentage of the time that a player strikes out. If the number of plate appearances is less than 100, right? That data statistically for major league players, let's forget for a second just minor league data. Major league players at less than 100 at bats, you can take the league average strikeout rate and use that as the predictor for what any given player's strikeout rate will be into the future, and that will be more accurate than whatever a player has delivered over a 30 games, over a less than 100 plate appearance sample, right? So and what that means is when you get to 100, it's not that player's strikeout rate is the predictor of his future. It's 51% of the player's future will be what he has displayed as the skill set, and 49% will be what is the major league average, right?
Right.
So that's 100 at bats. So to get to, whatever you want to get to in terms of a meaningful data set, in terms of, this is, I can look at a player's historical strikeout rate and say that's going to be his future value. You have to get into 2, 3, 4, 500 plate appearances, i.e. a full season, before you're even close to getting somewhere stable, right? So even if a guy has 3 months coming out of AA and his K rate is extremely elevated, I don't know that I'm ready to say that sample is all that much more relevant than just what the average 22-year-old should be striking out at this rate, right? And that's something that I think people don't really understand. They see a pitcher have a run of a couple hot innings. And when I say a couple hot innings, I'm talking about like less than 100 innings, right?
Right.
Like, i.e. a season for most young pitchers, right? If you think about most of the guys that are in single and AA, they're rarely getting over 100 innings. Things like that, right? The lack of stabilization means that the numbers that you see on the back of the player's baseball card is not predictive of what their actual performance is going to be. So we have to circle back to what is the alternative if the stats don't currently mean anything. Well, now we're back to scouting, right? And that's where I'm willing to buy the idea that there are plenty of people who have no idea what the hell they're talking about, right? So I think that's something that we have to there's a level of filtering that has to be done in terms of who you're taking information from, and believing that, if I don't have good data in terms of the stats, I'm going to have to find the sources that I want to trust, and finding the sources you want to trust is tough. Using your own eyes can be deceiving as well, because, oftentimes, I mean, unless you're really kind of going to these games on a regular basis, you're often relying on video, which is incomplete, which might be as well a very, very small sample size. So all of those different factors, I think, make it difficult to say, okay, blindly, I want to give it 100% weight to the scouting and 0% to the stats in that scenario, even when those small samples. But it's important to kind of understand that the continuum, basically, that as the data as you get more and more data, as a player moves up through the minor leagues, puts in 1,000 plate appearances through the various levels, now you're starting to have more meaningful data, and you want to talk about metrics, then we have that conversation. When a player has put in 30 DSL games,
right,
120 at bats, and we're looking at his K rate being 18 versus 47%, I'm not sure that you can really say he has a contact issue or he doesn't. Right? If you think about it, it's 15 called strikes in the wrong spot.
right. So let's pause there for 1 second, Tom. Right, because this is an interesting concept to me. So many of us in evaluating prospects in the fantasy context look at players who have struggled making contact, high strikeout rates. Just focusing on hitters for a second.
Mhm.
And we'll either dump a player or try to acquire a player based on, those metrics, or maybe reticent to acquire a player or trade because he's striking out 30% of the time, he can't hit, right? And it's an interesting concept to acknowledge that may actually not mean anything, right? Right. And so, particularly when it comes to the younger players, I'm talking about 17, 18-year-olds who do not play full seasons. I mean, for example, the DSL league that you mentioned, they don't start playing until June, right? Double A doesn't start playing, I think, till May, right? Triple A has just started, so that would, to me, warrant paying more attention to scouting grades as at the earlier stages in the career. Is that generally consistent with what you're saying?
I think that's generally what I'm saying. I think the idea, and I think honestly, I think that's oftentimes, if I mean, I don't have a ton of experience interfacing with other major league front offices, but what I've understood from what I've read and the people that I have spoken with, that is definitively what they're doing, which is basically the less reliable your data is, the more weight you apply to scouting grades and the visual evaluation. And there are some analysis now, so certain biometrics that are measurable that I think in small sample become a form of data, if you will, that's not true statistical production, but things like just literal bat speed through the zone, fastball velocity, those kinds of things have more stabilized much more quickly because the denominator is much larger. You can watch a guy swing 100 times in one single batting practice, right? You
Right.
can watch a guy throw 100 pitches in 1-2 starts. So you get the 100, if you will, to use a random round number because we have 10 figures and we think you base 10.
Right.
100 matters, but
right. So that brings up an interesting concept, which is some data points are stickier than others, right?
right.
So for example, I know I've read stuff, and I think we've talked about this before about exit velocity and launch angle kind of stabilizing more quickly, which in part has to do with the denominator that you're
yeah, exactly.
So with that in your mind, militate in favor of looking to data outputs of that ilk first in deciding whether to kind of give more weight to those as we see a prospect develop.
So an example, a good example to me is the aging curve of exit velocity, to use that as an example, right? So we know that a 17-year-old hitting a ball, 105 miles an hour is a lot more relevant than a 25-year-old hitting the ball 107 miles an hour in AAA. And the reason is because the 17-year-old has 6 more years in the weight room before he gets to the same point. And by the time he's 23, the muscle that the average 17-year-old adds by the time they're 23 adds to a certain amount of aging. You get an aging curve out of that in terms of the amount of exit velocity that's added. By the time they're 23, the guy who's hitting the ball 105 miles an hour may actually be able to hit the ball 115, 120 miles an hour and be those beasts that you see at the major league level.
Right.
Whereas the guy who's hitting at 107 is, that's a 15 homer, 20 homer a year, second baseman kind of profile.
Right.
And that's, I think, maybe 20 in back when the ball was juiced, maybe 10 to 15.
Right. No, I get your point. I mean, it's like a league average second baseman.
Right.
Between us, it's not a bad thing to be in as a human being. But in fantasy,
right, exactly. I mean, and this goes back. We had the discussion about real life value, et cetera. But just to finish that point on the biometrics and the stabilization and why those matter, I think in small sample, when I don't have enough of a data set to say this guy has a contact issue or this guy, home runs in a given season. And not only that, but a lot of the time in the DSL, a lot of those homers are not over the fence homers, which is an important categorization that people don't really conceptualize well, because we're talking about like glorified little league games basically, right, in the DSL. And so a lot of those homers are basically just like a well hit ball into the gap. The guy who's playing center field is a future first baseman if he even makes it. He's not catching the ball, it's ricocheting in the outfield, and the guy happens to have speed, and what is basically a hard hit liner is resulting in a home run, which looks like power, but that's very different than Aaron Judge clearing the fence in left field in Baltimore at 475 feet.
Right.
That's the important point, is that if you're seeing the guy hit the ball 105 and getting that data, the exit velocity at 105, even if the guy is struggling to make contact or is hitting the ball but not necessarily hitting homers because he hit a couple of grounders hard and he doesn't have the launch angle to actually hit the ball out of the yard, I'm much more interested in that than the fact that he hit 7 homers in 40 DSL games. So to your point, that's where those biometrics matter. Even if they become a form of scouting evaluation where it's like he hits the ball hard rather than the guy hit a bunch of homers, so he's going to be a power hitter in the future.
Right. And so, implicit in what you're saying is a couple points, I think. One is that, the level of competition matters, right? Particularly when it comes to scouting, right, in minor leaguers. And it's one thing to have success in the DSL. It's another thing to have it at AA, right? Because the level of competition is generally better. The center fielders are actually center fielders, not like glorified like center fielders who are actually first basemen. The data is probably more reliable in terms of the quality and the volume of data that you have at AA than versus the DSL. Like, for example, you may not be able to get reliable exit velocities for all the players in the DSL, right? I mean, there's some publications that are now publishing things like that. Baseball America has started to report, for example, DSL exit velocities. Which I find extremely useful. But, oftentimes, or, for many years, all we were left with is the raw statistics.
Right.
You could see the strikeout rates and those kind of things, but because that's just math. You also
they're not totally irrelevant either, right? I don't want to completely throw them out entirely, right? I do think there is some, it's probably probabilistically, it's probably more likely that the guy with the higher K rate is going to K more later, right? Even though it's 1% of the 99% at the beginning, and it becomes 2% of that information versus the league average 3% until you get to that 51 stabilization point we're talking about. But it's still some amount more, right? Striking out less is better than striking out more, just definitional.
Sure.
So there's some
directionally relevant.
Yes, exactly. But it's just not, it's not the weight and the end all be all that we often assign to it is the point I guess I'm trying to make.
Right. No, I understand. So, the other thing that happens in the minor leagues, of course, is promotions, right? And so you have data that is potentially skewed by the fact that a player jumped from, single A or high A, let's say, to triple A in one season, right? And so how do you evaluate a player that, let's say is 19, 20 years old and goes from high A all the way up to triple A in 1 year, right? Yeah. And you see the data at triple A and they struggle, however you want to call that, right? They strike out 30% of the time at, triple A in 50 plate appearances, right? But, their high A rate was like, 19%, and their double A rate was like 23%, right? And they're getting pushed. Right, and facing older, more developed competition as they advance. And so, how do you think about evaluating and considering the data in that context?
Well, I mean, so that's relevant, but then even further than that, the problem you have is a grave inconsistency in the minor league within a given level, just based on when in the season you go. So let's use the example of something like high A to double A range, right? If you think about the average college draftee, they're going to be just about all of them, right? All of those high-end pitchers and all those high-end bats, once they get drafted, will do that's their major league or their professional debuts. You hear about, in some cases high, but it's basically double A gets flooded with quality arms and quality
Right.
bats, right? Later in the season. So the draft happens. I don't even know what date it is. It's sometime late May, early June, let's say, after the College World Series. I don't even know what the exact date is, but
I think it's actually a little bit later than that. But
it
I
might even be July. Yeah, but some point so the point is in August, basically August and September, double A numbers tend to skew downward in terms of a guy that's been there that whole year. So if you have a guy who's continuing an upward trajectory, right? Let's say Josh Turio, for example, right? Who's dealing with a tack ball at the beginning of the year. So all the strikeout numbers are crazy high in that environment. So that's another factor, is the major league owners are constantly screwing with the rules. They're adding, subtracting rules. They're adding, subtracting, effects of the ball. They're inserting different types of balls within the given year in terms of the way they affect the grip on the breaking balls, etc. And so when you put all of those factors together, it's important to try and gather as much context as you can, because to your point, yes, age versus level matters, absolutely. But it's also, did the guy come up to double A to start the season and rake and then gets pushed to triple A and then kind of tails off? To me,
Right.
that would be less exciting than the guy who starts in single A, dominates low A, gets up to high A, gets up to double A, and continues that upward trajectory through double A when those 22, 23-year-olds are getting inserted into those lineups and is still continuing to perform at 18, 19, 20 years old. Versus that, as I said, to use that other example, the 22-year-old, 23-year-old, 24-year-old that some cases starts hot in double A, gets pushed to triple A, and is basically facing all the quad A guys waiting to get called up for rosters to expand in the later parts of the year, where the fastball velocity in some cases is lower. The average fastball velocity can be lower in triple A than it is in double A because of some of these factors.
Right. So in some respects, it sounds like you're identifying kind of a sweet spot for like identifying young prospect talent, which is like, these guys coming up when there's an influx and injection of real talent
Sure.
into the competition level at that
But the
double A.
problem is, again, it's those performance samples are like
Microscopic.
60 games, right? So 60 games is ideal if you're good, but I mean, you're probably getting 30, 40 games. So now you're back to 100, 150 maybe at bats. So, okay, strikeout rate is starting to normalize. Walk rate is starting to normalize. All of your power metrics just about are not really normalized, right? So it's a lot of, you're falling back again into, how do you weight that? So it is a little bit of a sliding scale, but, understanding the context of the narrative does matter a lot, right?
Right. So, we've talked a lot about hitting. So
Sure.
let's focus on pitching a little bit,
Sure.
which is trickier, right? Because the sample sizes are in many respects even less, right?
Yeah.
So when you think about looking at data for pitchers, what metrics are important to you, and like what's the sample size we're really talking about?
So again, with pitching, for me at least, is that, and again, I think some of this is the problem with some of this is it becomes, witchcraft in terms of trying to define, what is it was an injury prone delivery, right? Like some of that stuff, it's kind of, there's a lot of that stuff, right?
Yeah.
But if you're talking about metrics, I think the number one thing is fastball velocity, right? As far as I'm concerned, I think that still plays that, all of these pitch shape stuff, metrics that I talk about at the major league level, on which we have good data on. We're now starting to get it for AAA. We have it for some of the low A parks that happen to be spring training parks. So we're starting to have a decent amount of data on that. I think some of that's some of the best small sample analysis we currently have the capacity to do. And all of that stuff, when you boil it back down, really boils down to fastball velocity, right? You're not going to get a guy, and again, there are some exceptions for side armors who throw a crazy wiffle ball. I forget the Angels reliever there that throws completely sidearm, but he throws like 87 miles an hour, and it kind of comes up at the hitter.
Right. The Moneyball reference is Chad Bradford.
Yeah, exactly. The Moneyball type, the Chad Bradford type, basically. Yeah, I mean, you've seen those guys through history. And Bradford actually threw harder, if I'm not mistaken. But anyway, neither here nor there. The point I was just trying to get to is fastball velocity matters a lot, and fastball velocity normalizes quickly because if we go back to the denominator, you don't need a full season's worth to know that a guy throws X,
Right.
in a given for a given pitch. Now, there's some nuances there, which is especially if you're evaluating starting pitchers, one thing that matters a lot for a starting pitcher is holding velocity. If you look at the guys that get to be starting pitchers, is they throw 100 miles an hour in the first inning and they throw 100 miles an hour in the sixth inning, right?
Yep.
In the seventh inning, ideally, and later, but at least to the fourth, fifth, the velocity is the same.
None of these kids are pitching into the seventh, really.
Right. Well, so but even the fourth or fifth, right? I think it's important to note that I think there's a big difference in a guy who, either comes out in one inning and throws 100, 102 nowadays, or even guys that are being held to 3 inning outings and is averaging 95, 96 on his fastball versus, or let's say 97, 98 in 2-3 inning spurts versus the guy that's being allowed to throw 4 or 5 innings and still averaging 96 on his fastball, let's say, right? He's a tick or two lower, but he's holding it through the entirety of the outing. Whereas those guys that, you read the reports and it's like the velocity is down. You get some of the data and some of these game logs and you see that, you basically see it's kind of like stable for a couple of innings and then it just drops off a cliff. And that basically is a big, again, now you going into the scouting context, and is it a bigger guy? Is it projectionable that he might eventually build up some of that stamina? What is the age of that pitcher? If he's 17, I care more about, I care less about holding velocity than I do if you're 24, things like that, right? So again, it's that constant need to kind of circle back on the marriage and the narrative witchcraft pieces that I was talking about in terms of evaluating the delivery and the projection ability of a player. When I say projection ability, like physical projection ability, and but setting that aside, right, I come back to, as I said, I think velocity, I think, is a very, very important metric. And then the other thing we're starting to have data on is spin rate. Which is another big component. Spin rate basically translates in various forms into movement, right? Depending on the type of pitch. And that, I think, is another thing that we're starting to have data on. So, barring an ability to kind of build a full stuff model, which, as I said, I think we're starting to get that for the AAA level, but we don't really have in a complete sense anywhere else.
Yep.
Getting some of those data points, which you can get from, simply having somebody who's set up a high-speed camera at a game, right? A scout can now pull that data on their own if they so choose. Getting some of those metrics, I think, can be good predictors because, again, those are pitch by pitch data points that normalize much more quickly than the fact that the guy had a bunch of walks in a given outing because he's being asked to throw in an environment where it's automatic balls and strikes for the first time in his life, and players are allowed to challenge any call that's borderline, and the system isn't fully calibrated, and all of a sudden every single pitcher's walk rate is going through the roof, and every batter is taking the strategy of simply just not swinging, and you look at swing rates kind of come down through the floor because every batter's just like, I'll just get on base by just not swinging and waiting for these guys to throw borderline pitches that are going to get all balls, and that's just the narrative that has to color any analysis you're doing on the,
right. All right, so let's pause there for a second because we've talked a lot about like what metrics we want to look at, right? And one of the things you're saying is you're focusing on data points that will normalize more quickly because of the denominator, right? It's in both for hitters and for pitchers, speed matters, velocity, right? Exit velocity and fastball velocity. Which doesn't bode well, for example, for crafty lefties. but yes, so, and spin rate, for pitchers. Now we don't have that data at least readily available for a lot of the levels, right?
Correct.
Right. So AAA, sure, AA maybe, and then it's kind of a morass after that. Although, like I said, you start to get exit velocity reports on hitters, and you wonder what the sample size is for that exit velocity. Right. But, at what point do you think you have a critical mass to actually rely on the exit velocity for a hitter or the fastball velocity for a pitcher?
So, now you're getting into kind of, this is where, we're on the edge of the public research that's been done, right? Because it's kind of this, a lot of this data is 5 years old in some cases, and that's the extent of it, right? So we don't really have enough kind of historical data to really backtest some of these hypotheses. Somebody can do a study that's totally reasonable from a statistical perspective, but there are some self-admitted holes, not because the person's doing it wrong, simply because they don't have 100 years of baseball data to base it off of. They have, in some cases, if we're talking about AAA, a year and a half of data to base it off of, right? And again, you have all these context relevant pieces of, there's a tack ball that's being used, there's a pitch clock that's being introduced, there's bigger bait, like all of these factors, these pretty big game changing rules that are being introduced that affect the game in a variety of ways that don't really make 2018 data, 2019 data, apples to apples to 24 data, even, right? If we're talking about 23 or 24 data for a 5-year sample. So putting all of that aside in terms of what defines a relevant sample, again, you can go back to some of the analysis has been done as it relates to exit velocity. The argument is 90th percentile, 95th percentile exit velocity is a better indicator than single top end velocity. So again, that nice round number that we're talking about is 100, right? If you get 100 batted balls, right, now the 95th percentile, you start to get a better sense of what that range will be from the 90 to the 95th. You can kind of see whether that's a good fit or not. So these are all again, it's like ideally we would have 300 innings of a pitcher's K rate to kind of look at to figure it out, but we have 20 innings, so you have to look at ideally we'd have 100 batted ball events to look at, but we probably have 20, 25. And again, that doesn't mean it's 0% predictive. It also doesn't mean it's 100% predictive. It means, it's probably less than 50% predictive is what it means.
Right.
So let's figure out, how much we want to weight that. And again, the more data you have, the more, if you get a full season at AAA of batted ball data, that's probably more relevant than Scout X reported that he saw a ball hit, according to the TrackMan data, the team's TrackMan data said that the one of the balls went out at 107 miles an hour.
Yeah. We paused there for a second. Like one guy that excites me is J.J. Walton of the Phillies.
Mm-hmm.
Young prospects, big kid. He's 225. Like I think he's 6'2", 6'3". Played in the DSL. Now he's going to face competition on the state side. Very small sample size, but Baseball America reported his exit velocities, which were outrageous, like they were high. And so the question is, like, how much weight do you give those exit velocities?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think if you're, in terms of, as far as I'm concerned, to me, that is that data point is a flag. Right. It's just little, if you're sort of kind of the old school pros and cons list.
Yeah.
Right? It's like it's a check mark in the pros list. I don't know that I can take that and translate that to, that's an 80 grade power, done deal.
Right.
That's what it is. It probably is going to be 60 to 80. Right. Now,
right.
What is it going to be? And then you get into raw versus game power in terms of, the guy can hit a cement mixer. I mean, if you can even call it a slider in the DSL, what happens when it's a breaker that's on the black from a major league pitcher, right?
Right.
To hit those balls hard is two very, very different skill sets. And so I think there's an important nuance there to kind of understand, what contextualize, if you will, the data point. So a high exit velocity in the early minors is certainly a check in the positive, certainly a player that you watch. I'm just not ready to in terms of, and this is me kind of verbally and mentally trying to create that continuum without having applied a set mathematical formula to it. But inherently, that's what we're talking about, right? We're just applying some weights to it. The weight I applied to it is not yet a definitive, 100% predictor, if you will, of power.
Right. So before we transition to talking about kind of maybe how we apply all this to, the prospect handbook, for example, or, how we think about that, I wanted to touch on one other thing and get your views on it, which is, evaluating prospects coming into the first year player draft. So there are players who have had statistical outputs in the minor leagues. All right. Some pitchers get shut down, for example, and have none.
Yeah.
After they've been drafted, because we as fantasy players, we draft them 6 months after, right? So there are also players who have, had output in college, and have stats, whatever they're worth, at the college level, but either in their senior year or over the course of 2 or 4 years, right? And then you have players who have statistical output in high school, right? And so, how do you think about all that data, those statistics, in terms of, are those things you look at, for example, like their college data or their like cup of coffee in the minors? What's your thought on that?
So any non-professional setting, I am extremely skeptical of. Now, if you want to tell me SEC pitching and hitting, there's some more relevant data sets there. But again, you're running into, I mean, you see the videos all the time, right? In terms of the level of competition still is not there. In terms of, you still have a bunch of players that don't belong on the same field as those
Right.
pitchers. So,
Right. It's kind
tough
of like
hitting.
college football, right? Like,
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Even going through a lineup. I mean, Skeens is as dominant a pitcher as it gets, but if he's having a tough inning, he walks the one guy who's dangerous in the other lineup, and oftentimes he's facing a guy that will never sniff, anything above, let's say, single A, and if he ever gets there.
Right.
And so that's that's a difference in terms of saying, even though the age is a little higher, you have less talented players competing as part of that pool, if that makes sense, right? Than
Yep.
you would in the minors. I think the minor league, if you want to say the equivalent of college ball is high A, double A, somewhere in there. It's the experience and polish is equivalent of that, but the talent level is below that, if that makes sense. And those two things kind of being married together gets you back to that same level.
Yep.
So, in terms of, you hear guy hit, 500 with a 600 OBP and a 900 slugging, you get these video game numbers sometimes, and it's like, I'm not looking at that as saying, okay, that's the next Mike Trout, right? It's not, I don't think the translation can be done. Again, to the extent you want to talk about fastball velocity and exit velocity metrics, I'm a little bit more willing to hear. Fastball velocity, I'm more willing to hear. Exit velocity, now you've got the bats, which is a huge difference, right? So
100%.
now
Yeah,
the bats
particularly in college.
Yeah, for college bats. Yeah.
Yeah, no doubt.
So I'm often more interested to hear about, a lot of these guys will go and play the Cape Cod League or it used to be the Alaska League. Some of these bigger all-star leagues where they play with wood bats. So some of that, I'll be interested to hear. Guy couldn't catch up to guy with crazy college numbers goes to the Cape Cod League and can't hit. That's kind of where, we're talking about the check marks in both categories. That's a check in the red, if you will, because,
right. So
that's a sign that might be an issue.
Yeah, a lot of the stats you're talking about are like directional indicators,
Exactly.
Possible directional indicators, not something you want to hang your hat on.
Yeah, I'm not looking at a guy. The guy could get on base 90% of the time and hit 400 homers in a college season. I'm not weighing that any more heavily than a check in the positive. The same way, high exit velocity metrics from a 17-year-old are relevant.
Right.
I just don't see it as translatable in a way that's meaningful.
Right, particularly in the context. I mean, I agree with you. I mean, particularly in the context of evaluating prospects in terms of fantasy and kind of hedging your bets on how they're going to be as a major league player, because that's ultimately what this is about.
Right.
All right, so let's talk brass tacks in terms of moving forward. Like, how do you think about integrating the data and when it's appropriate to start giving it more weight relative to scouting?
Well, I mean, I think, and sorry to circle back on the college guys, right? In terms of, do you weigh now? We're talking about single A, double A data, right? I think that does have value, right? I think again, it's not a 51% predictor yet, right? So until the guys played close to a full season, we're not really talking about any data you can really take from it. Now, again, the exit velocity, to the extent it's available, the ISO, on a that's something that will normalize a little bit sooner than some of the other parametrics, right? So,
Right.
the more data you get, the more I'm willing to kind of start plucking from those data sets. But honestly, I mean, I couldn't tell you, my decision to consider Wyatt Langford first overall was not based on his double A performance last year, right? The fact that his team promoted him was very contextually important in terms of getting him up to double A, right? Notably, Dylan Cruz was as well, right? To circle back to our original conversation.
Yep.
but I don't know that his K rate in, I don't know, whatever it was, 40 double A at bats or 50 double A at bats is something that I'm looking at and saying, oh, that guy's not going to strike out in the major leagues.
Right. And this goes back to a point that you and I know have privately talked about a lot, but and I've said on the show a few times, you know, there's something to be said for the Major League Baseball organization's view of a prospect as
Yes.
illustrated by their promotion of him,
Right.
right? Because they know more than we do, right? They actually know the most about the player, right?
Yeah.
And if you see them promoting, a Langford or a Cruz, or take your pick, Yuri Perez or whomever, right? It is a strong indicator, that person is more talented than his peers.
Yeah. And you want to talk about, data sets, et cetera. Those teams are collecting. I mean, they've got their pitchers wearing things. They got the arm speed. They've got the shape of every single pitch that player has thrown from the day he signed, right? And so you want to talk about relevant samples. Those teams have fully developed stuff models by the time the guy hits spring training. Forget after that. You want to talk about hitters. They've got the bat speed through the zone. They've got every angle, every nitro zone, every hot zone, every cold zone for every batter in terms of what that bat path looks like, what they're trying to do with the launch angle, with the likelihood of changing that launch angle based on the rotational, torque that the hitter is creating. I mean, all of those metrics, which sound like witchcraft, sorcery that we talked about. Again, this is that whole circling back on itself, right? Of if you go back 20 years ago, where 30 years ago, where the way scouting or prospect analysis amounted to purely like the guy looks good getting off the bus, right? Again, we have metrics that better approximate this, but the fact that the guy swings the bat extremely hard and can do so 80 times in a row in a lab, and the guy and the team can truly measure that, is a relevant thing, which is likely driven by the fact that he's 6'5" and has giant arms, right? So yeah, not every guy who's giant and has 6'5" and has giant arms will swing the bat really hard,
right?
But more of those guys tend to, and that's why that's it. It's our data and our statistics finally catching up to analysis that there's a reason that we did it that way. And yes, Moneyball has proven you can find plenty of holes in that analysis because it was incomplete, but the modern version is still in my opinion, still continues to marry, the scouting analysis with these metrics that, basically translate back to.
Right. There is a correlation between the two, right?
Yes. Yes.
And we're finding it's like a, self-fulfilling prophecy in some ways.
Yeah.
So that's interesting. Well, look, this is all very fascinating. And I think you and I are going to have continued conversations, during the season and the off season about the prospect handbook and how to best integrate on the field results with the scouting reports, which I rely on very heavily. Although this conversation is bolstered my confidence in my approach to evaluating prospects. But I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you briefly about whether you have any crushes or fades, as you enter the season.
Yeah. Let's see. I mean, I think a well-discussed fade. I think. I mean, honestly, it's any prospect that's getting too much hype, right? I think the Evan Carter. You could argue it. Why we had lengthy discussions, I think, on the ABL Discord channel about that. And my view that that Carter was sold, and the reason I traded him away was because I felt like he was at the peak of his value in terms of how he was being evaluated. But I mean, obviously, I drafted Langford but still could make the point that I think he similarly, is being rated in a way that's probably irrational, right? I think to kind of expect a guy to show up and be better than JD Martinez in his prime is not realistic. I mean, JD Martinez is one of the better hitters of the last 10 years. Langford may develop into that. The data and the trend seems to be suggesting that he's moving that direction, but I think it's being treated as a fait accompli. And I think some of these higher end prospects, I think, are seen as such can't miss when there still is, there's a significant chance to miss, right? I mean, you look at, everybody was in love with Javier Baez, right? Everybody was ready to call him the second coming. And it took 3 years for him to even be a meaningful major league asset. And now I'm talking about major league value versus fantasy value.
Sure. So Javi's defense was like a real calling card for him, right?
Right.
Yeah, I mentioned this on a couple shows ago. Is Bo Bichette is a good example for me, like who in fantasy circles was considered like a unanimous first round draft pick.
Right.
And now we're seeing he's a good ball player.
Yeah.
Is he like an upper echelon fantasy asset? I honestly don't know. He's worth having on your roster. Is he the second coming? Like I don't think so. But the verdict's still out. I mean, he could be, right? So yeah, it does take time to, I think, adjust and actually get a meaningful sample size from these players.
Yeah,
we have some comments in the So like I think it's going to be really interesting to see how Langford develops into a player, and we just don't know yet. But you might trade him.
I might. I mean, and again, the problem is that getting fair value for a number one pick that is up in the majors on basically a minor league contract, right, in his first year in a league like ABL is going to be near impossible. I mean, I would say nothing is impossible, but damn near impossible. So this is not a call for send me every trade offer for Wyatt Langford. My point is simply, I think guys like that at the top of those prospect rankings, the top of preseason prospect rankings, who show any form of performance in spring training, just kind of explode in a way that I don't think is commensurate with their actual future valuation. Now, as holding that market asset, the best move probably will still be to hold him. But the point is simply that players in that vein are often, the least. Like the upside is priced in at this point, right?
Right.
There's no more profit to be had. You're much better off trying to get in to Jazz Chisholm or CJ Abrams a year after they failed, when the prospect shine has reduced, and that's when we've had shared experiences with those players where investing in those players tends to draw much greater profit.
Right. My love for Jazz. So my love for Jazz.
Long documented.
I just ordered, by the way, a Jazz Chisholm jersey.
Oh, there you go. And it's something that seeing the fact that you regularly send me those like field level clips or pretty much any form of social media, that he does pretty much like 3 to 7 times a day has made it a damn near fait accompli that was going to happen.
He's the best.
I guess I'd be remiss without mentioning one quick crush that I currently have. I picked him up in ABL and a couple other leagues that we shared. Logan Evans.
Oh, sure.
He's a pitcher in the Seattle system, which that alone makes him interesting as far as I'm concerned for a couple of reasons. A, their pitching development successes, but also their aggressiveness in promoting major league pitchers up to the major league level, right? I mean, we saw last year Brian Wu and Bryce Miller, I believe both make the jump from Double-A or possibly even Single-A for Wu.
Something like that. I mean, they
something crazy, but they basically and this is the whole stuff analysis that I was talking about, right? They I believe, and my understanding from reports that I've read is basically it's not because Brian Wu had like an ERA of like 4, I think, in the minors, so it's not like his performance was great. They look at them, they analyze the pitch quality, the stuff metrics, if you will, and in a small sample determine that stuff will play at the major league level and say, let's give that guy a chance to fail. The pitches are major league level quality. The command, it's going to take longer than to figure out anyway. So let's give him a shot. And in some of those cases, they return kind of positive major league value right away, right? Rather than wasting those bullets in the minors. And those guys can continue to learn and refine and become ace level pitchers in 3 years, even if they're 4 ERA pitchers right now. But those guys are right now as good, if not better, than your 4th, 5th starter in the major league rotation, and that's what you saw last year. Is you got a number 3 and a number 5 basically out of those 2 players that would have in just about every other organization been left to languish in the minors and probably dominate in the minors eventually, right? I think both those players, while their performance was not incredible in the minors, over a full season would have normalized to you put a number 4 starter or number 3 starter back into Double-A, and he's going to murder that league.
Yep.
So the Logan Evans, beyond just the organizational argument, the Logan Evans interest is driven based on the fact that that's a pitcher that's shown a lot. It's a large frame pitcher. If we're talking about projectability, etc.
I love that.
Who was retaining a certain level of velocity and was interesting for that reason as a starter because of his plus secondaries and like decent velocity last year. And then he came into spring and he was throwing 99 miles an hour. And all of a sudden, you've got a guy who has the plus secondaries, had average velocity, now has plus velocity, and is a workhorse type build that is being billed as a starting pitcher. Pitchers always have reliever risk to some extent, but he's viewed as a starting pitcher in that organization, it sounds like.
Right.
And something like that that's available for free to me is something that's worth a flyer. It's still, I think he's 22, I think, something like that. I believe he's starting in Double-A or Triple-A, so he's not there yet. But the spring metrics were very interesting. Obviously when you're throwing 99 miles an hour with plus secondaries, your stuff metrics are going to be good. So all the small sample, analytics that I'm looking at are good. The scouting narrative is interesting. That's the kind of it's kind of flyer I want to be taking in the kind of league where pitching is overvalued, as I know, or overweight, right? You can decide.
Right. So you heard it here first. Everybody should go pick up Logan Evans. I like it. I like the recommendation. Well, listen, buddy, this has been great to have you on the show. And I could talk baseball with you all night. But we want to let our audience go to sleep, I suppose. And you too. I know you've got little ones at home, so we'll let you get back to that. But great having you on, and we'll be talking throughout the summer, I'm sure, about baseball and hopefully about the Celtics getting to the NBA Finals too, which we haven't even talked about. But that's I know that's a mutual interest.
It's another podcast, but yes,
another podcast. And so thanks for coming on. We'll have you on again, and good luck with the ABL and your rebuild. And the interim for everybody else, remember to ABP, always be prospecting.